Hey there, my name is Michael Finney. Thank you for tuning in. This audio series is an exploration of the Nobel-winning mathematician John Nash through the perspective of Jal, who goes by the handle SoCryptotoshi on Twitter. Glad to have the opportunity to talk with you a bit, Jal. Can you tell us about how you initially came into contact with Nash's work?
I played poker full time for 3 years. I did decent. I lived off it. I'd be happy to make that kind of money. It was American dollars. I live in Canada, and I would go on the forum. There's a main poker forum, and there's some pretty smart people there. And I was trying to argue that the Nash, because we use the Nash Equilibrium in poker, like with the type of poker I played, you would say to a guy, what kind of hands would you play in this situation? What would you raise? What would you fold or whatever? And so you'd say, I'd play Nash, or I'd play it a little wider than Nash, or I would play it a little less, a little tighter than Nash. So like you're really using the word Nash all day, and we all know because it's Nash Equilibrium. Well, I went on the forum trying to argue that ultimately the Nash Equilibrium is meant for bringing about peace. And they were saying, no, it's for conflict and war. And I noticed that some of the things I was describing, they were saying it was wrong. And then I realized, okay, the words, I'm not using standard accepted definitions. And so I started reading some of his work and learning a little more about it. And eventually I came across Ideal Money, and I was like, oh, it's 8 pages, I'll read it. And I couldn't understand any of it, but I could barely get the idea that it said something significant. He was trying to get something across, and it was like a grand idea. And so I kept thinking about it, and I said, I like to take things like that and think of them in my own terms. So I rewrote it, and instead of banks, I used poker sites, and instead of chips, instead of money, I used chips, and I called it Ideal Poker. And so I would read Ideal Poker, and it would speak to me about what was going on in the poker industry. And so I was reading all that, and then I was reading The Bargaining Problem one day and thinking, okay, you have money without trade, and then you have money in trade. And so what's the next evolution? And somewhere around that time, my buddy had come up to me and said, hey, did you hear about this Bitcoin thing? Apparently you solve puzzles and then you get Bitcoin. No one knows who created it. And so I was like, oh, that's cool. And I might have watched a video on it. And it was about 6 years ago. It was sometime between Mt. Gox and $177 US. And so I was reading The Bargaining Problem and thinking, what would be the next evolution of money? And I was just like, oh, Bitcoin. And then I was thinking, and I was just like, oh, Ideal Money. And then I thought I'd come up with the epiphany, like that's how I learned about Ideal Money.
Who is John Nash, and what gets confused about him?
I always say we all know who John Nash is, and I guess I'm more speaking to a phrase I don't really like to use, but the Western world. Because most people that you ask, you'll say, well, John Nash, I don't know who John Nash is. You say, what about that movie with Russell Crowe, starring Russell Crowe, called A Beautiful Mind, with that mathematician that eventually goes into madness? And then people are like, I know who that is. Right. Yes, that guy. And you say like, oh yeah, he had schizophrenia or something. And so we know him through that movie. We tend to have a little bit of an understanding of his biography, and I want to question.
Please go into more detail about the 4 papers Nash released early in his career.
For the people who have watched the movie, or some people who are more academic and sort of know a little bit more about the actual papers he wrote, we have a little bit of a stigma about what he went through, how he went through it, and then so the story goes, he eventually recovered. And so, can we talk about his mental illness from the 1950s? Well, one of the first things I want to bring up is at the end of the movie, it shows him taking medication, and this is how he got better. But it's well known, and it's not conspiracy. It's in his actual biography. He didn't actually take medication to get better. He sort of naturally recovered. There's some sort of a remarkable story there. And so going back through the movie, there's all these scenes in it where they're, again, it's not conspiracy, but they're just not correct. And so one of the scenes, his wife Alicia comes into the insane asylum, and she's got a stack of papers, and she throws them on the desk in front of him and says, "John, like, you thought you were writing to the government and corresponding with them, but these were never sent." So that's one scene in the movie, and those letters were actually sent. The NSA released one of them, I think within the last 10, 15 years, and there's some remarkable insights in those papers. So Ideal Money, so we were talking about the history of his quote-unquote mental illness. I don't mean to argue that he didn't slide into some form of a mental illness, but I know that there's sort of an untold and not understood story that at least goes alongside that. So back at that time, John Nash was just crushing, academia around mathematics and then certain other subjects that he was spreading out to. And so he had these 4 insights from these 4 papers: the Nash Equilibrium, the bargaining problem, the Unbreakable encryption conjecture, and parallel control.
That's a significant volume of output. Clearly, he was on a brilliant streak at that time. However, I think it's important to notice that in the wake of these realizations, he seems to have become exhausted. Will you address the period in the 1950s when he suffered from intense cognitive stress, what some may refer to as a phase of mental illness?
And so he had these 4 insights from these 4 papers. He has all those, and then all of a sudden, and this is how the story goes, he starts to go crazy. And what it's known, or you can even hear him say this, he said he was going around saying that the anti-communists and the communists were actually on the same side, colluding against the people. And he was going around saying he was the next Jesus and he was going to save the people. And then he was saying that the government was after him, and then he would start calling home and calling his friends and using fake names, and then eventually he fled to Europe, and he wanted to denounce his citizenship, and that's all fairly much in his bio. It's not perfectly depicted in the movie, but that's what they're trying to depict in the movie. Well, when he got to Europe, and I kind of knew this when I was researching him, and then eventually I found him talking about it, and I have it. It's in a video clip in an interview. He says this was the time when he came up with Ideal Money because he wanted to, and then he wanted to change his American dollars into the Swiss franc. So Ideal Money is a very old idea that comes out of this time. So he went to Europe, and then his wife was in contact with the military. They tracked him down there, and the story goes he was taken back by the Navy. In his words, he was taken back in chains.
Will you go into further detail about each of his 4 insights?
So one of those papers was a letter to the NSA. That was, the NSA released that letter, and I call it he calls it the Unbreakable encryption conjecture. And so he writes a letter to the NSA, and he basically says, I've realized that encryption exponentially outraces decryption. And I'm not a mathematician. I'm trying to be general here. I think some mathematicians would say that's a fine summary, and some would say, well, that's not exactly what he was saying. But he says, like, you have to believe me, and you can see he's just scribbling it out. He's like, I have something important. You have to get your greatest minds to consider this. He says we can use this to keep track of foreign nations and their understanding of encryption by comparing it to this insight. And he says, I think I've created a machine or designs for a machine that may have this property, and I've sent them to Rand. And so he says the basic insight is easy to see. Encryption will outrace decryption. And they write him back and say, well, we didn't receive that machine from Rand, and they corresponded a couple times, and then that was the end of it. So that's one example of a correspondence that he did have where that scene in the movie is not correct. Now there's another paper that's significant. There's 4 of them, and the other paper is called Parallel Control, and he sent this. It's a memorandum to Rand, and right in the opening paragraphs, he says the idea is to decentralize control. And he starts going over, and it has a scaling insight in it. And he says, wouldn't it be better to have 100 computers work on one problem to solve it in one day, rather than have those 100 computers take 100 days to each solve that problem? And so it's a way of connecting computers. And there's this one picture there that shows it says communication network in the middle. It's got circles around it, and then it's got spokes coming out of it to all the other sort of computers. I had someone I had met who was doing machine learning and AI. I was like, we already have this. And I understand that maybe some of the basic designs that he gave, because he designs it all out in the memo. We may have that, but at the end he talks about genuinely thinking machines. And it's interesting that he closes. He says, in closing, the brain is a highly parallel setup. It has to be.
You've covered 2 of the 4 insights. Please give us some detail on the other 2, known as the bargaining problem and the Nash equilibrium.
The bargaining problem. The basic idea with this solution that he put forward in a paper, and that this was, so all of these papers are around 1950 to 1955, I believe. I think they all are, but they're all around that time. He was about 25. The bargaining problem, the way I explain it is, it shows a situation of trade without money, and then it shows how money optimizes it. So you can have, with certain starting assumptions, and they say it shows how young he was at the time, because he used like a pocket knife, a baseball glove, a baseball bat. And so you have all these items, and you have 2 players, and they're going to bargain. And the idea is, when you have a transferable utility and you put it in the equation, more trades can happen. So I'll explain it where, if you want to trade a car for a truck, but the truck is worth much more, you don't want to chop a piece of the truck off, right? So you have money that can fill in the difference between the 2, and so you can have a more granular solution. And then the other paper of his was non-cooperative games, it's called, and they say it was his thesis or his doctorate, and he's got 2 citations in it. I think one is von Neumann and one is himself. And the Nash equilibrium is that's the solution that he comes up in. It's called the Nash equilibrium, and what it is a general solution to all non-cooperative finite games. And it's an interesting solution. It's the one he's most known for, and it has in it doesn't provide, you can't apply it to a game and then you solve it and now you know the best move. But what he proved is that all such games do in fact have a solution. And so it's almost like you would hand that in to a professor and they'd say, well, that's great, but now you need to find that solution. But there's an insight there of you don't even need that. You can be very, very general, and then there's the solution. So he put that paper forward, and then it was decades later, I guess about 40 years later, in 1994, I believe, where he won a Nobel Prize for it. Now, I recently seen him in an interview, or seen from an interview that was like recent, maybe in the last 10 years or so, comparatively recent. He said they didn't know the ramifications of that paper at that time, but I did. And that paper is known to have had a dramatic effect on many of the sciences, not just economics, with which the game theory was applied to. And I've heard it's one of the most cited papers, or the most cited.
The next episode will be available soon.